Frank Lucas had 50 employees. Nicky Barnes had a 7-man council that controlled every ounce of heroin north of 110th Street. Frank Matthews had a distribution network that stretched from New York to the West Coast and into 21 states. These were the most powerful drug lords in American history. Hollywood made movies about them. Magazines put them on covers. The FBI built entire task forces around their names. But there is one story that none of them ever wanted told. The story of the person who moved more product through Harlem than half of their lieutenants combined. A person who was not a man, not a wife, not a girlfriend holding cash in a shoebox under a bed. A person who walked into school wearing a full-length mink coat at 8 in the morning and bragged to her teachers, to their faces, about making $300,000 in a single month. She was 16 years old. Before she turned 17, she had her own stamp on her product, her own brand, her own condominiums, her own Cadillacs. Before she could legally vote, the most powerful drug lords in Harlem were fighting over her loyalty, not the other way around. By the time she died, they found $4 million in cash hidden inside one of her apartments in Riverdale, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the Bronx. She was a teenager. Her name was Maxine Walters. The streets called her Red Top. And the story of how a teenage girl from the poorest blocks of Harlem became the most powerful female operator in the history of New York's drug trade is the one story that Hollywood, the feds, and even the legends themselves never wanted you to hear, because it changes everything you thought you knew about who really ran the empire. To understand what Red Top did, you have to understand the world she was born into, because this was not a woman who stumbled into the game by accident. This was a girl who was shaped by a neighborhood that had already made its decision about what survival looked like, long before she was old enough to make her own choices. Maxine Walters was born in 1955 in Harlem, New York City. And when people say Harlem in the 1950s and 1960s, they picture the Apollo Theater on 125th Street, the jazz clubs, the brownstones, the culture, the pride. And that was real. But so was the other Harlem. The Harlem where the factories were closing one by one and the jobs were leaving with them. The Harlem where redlining had locked black families out of mortgages, out of business loans, out of every single legitimate pathway to wealth that white America had built for itself, and then pulled up the ladder behind it. By the time Maxine was growing up in the mid-1960s, the neighborhood was buckling under the weight of poverty so deep that entire blocks looked like they had been abandoned by the city itself. Crumbling stoops, boarded up windows on buildings that used to hold families of 10, men standing on corners at noon on a Tuesday, not because they were lazy, but because there was nowhere else to go and nothing waiting for them even if there was. The schools were underfunded. The hospitals were overcrowded. The police were either absent or hostile. And into that vacuum, heroin arrived like a second economy, like a parallel government that delivered what the real one would not. It brought money, it brought structure, it brought hierarchy, it brought order to blocks where the city had left nothing but chaos. And it brought men like Frank Lucas and Frank Matthews, who were building empires out of powder and pain while the rest of America pretended Harlem did not exist. Maxine saw all of it. She saw what the game gave people, and she saw what it took away, and she saw it earlier than almost anyone, because she had a family member, an uncle, who was already deep in the life. One account puts her first exposure to a drug transaction as a young girl, watching an exchange happen in plain sight, watching the money change hands, watching the way people moved around the men who had it, the way their posture changed, the way their voices dropped. That was the moment. Not a decision exactly, but a recognition. A child's eyes seeing the only economic system that was actually functioning in her world. She understood, the way children in those neighborhoods understood things that no child should ever have to understand, that the only people in her world with any real power at all were the people in the game. Everyone else was waiting. Waiting for a check. Waiting for a program. Waiting for a miracle. The people in the game were not waiting for anything. And Maxine Walters had one quality that separated her from every other teenager on those blocks. She was fearless, not reckless. Fearless. There is a difference that matters more in this world than in any other. Reckless gets you killed in a week. Fearless, combined with intelligence, combined with a level of beauty that stopped conversations when she entered a room, combined with a charisma that made grown men twice her age stop talking and start listening when she spoke, that was something else entirely. That was not just a personality trait, that was a weapon, and by the time she was 15 years old, she had decided how she was going to use it. This is what made Red Top different from every other hustler in 1970s Harlem. She did not think like a runner. She did not think like a corner boy waiting for a re-up. She thought like a CEO running a distribution company, and she built her operation with a level of sophistication that men with twice her experience and 10 times her age could not match. Red Top's entry into the business came through her proximity to the two most powerful drug lords in Harlem at the time, Frank Lucas and Frank Matthews. Lucas was running Blue Magic, the branded heroin that had become the most recognized product on the streets of New York City and beyond. His supply chain ran directly from the Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia to 116th Street in Harlem, cutting out the Italian middlemen entirely. That single innovation, bypassing the Lucchese family and every other mafia distributor in New York, had made Lucas the richest black drug dealer in America. His product was purer, his prices were lower, his brand recognition was higher than any competitor. Matthews was doing something similar on an even wider geographic scale, moving product across state lines into more than 20 states with the logistical efficiency of a Fortune 500 distribution company, employing couriers, managers, accountants, and regional supervisors the same way Procter & Gamble employed sales reps. Both men recognized something in Red Top immediately. This was not just another teenager looking to make a quick dollar on a street corner. This was someone with an instinct for the business, for the timing, for the management of people and product that most of their adult lieutenants did not possess and never would. Lucas trusted her with Blue Magic itself. Think about that for a moment. Blue Magic was the crown jewel of Frank Lucas's entire empire. It was the highest purity heroin on the streets, sold at half the price of the competition because Lucas had eliminated every middleman between the poppy field and the customer. It was the product that had made him a millionaire several times over. It was the product that would later inspire an entire Hollywood movie. And he put it in the hands of a 16-year-old girl from Harlem. He did not do that because she was pretty. He did not do that because he felt sorry for her. He did it because she could move product. She could move it faster, cleaner, and more efficiently than men who had been in the game for a decade. Her distribution network was tight. Her money was always correct. Her inventory never came up short. She ran her operation the way a supply chain manager runs a warehouse. Every unit accounted for, every dollar tracked, every employee in their assigned territory at the assigned time. Frank Matthews went even further. He gave Red Top her own stamp, her own brand identity. In the heroin trade of the 1970s, a stamp was everything. It was your trademark. It was your quality guarantee. It was your reputation compressed into a single word pressed onto a glassine bag. And when customers saw that stamp, they knew exactly what they were getting. It was brand recognition in the purest sense, the same principle that makes someone reach for a Coca-Cola instead of a generic soda. Matthews gave Red Top the stamp DOA. Dead on arrival. Think about what that means. One of the most powerful drug traffickers in American history, a man whose operation spanned the eastern seaboard, looked at a teenage girl and said, "You have earned the right to put your name on the product." That was not a gift. That was not charity. That was a corporate promotion. That was a regional vice president being handed her own product line because the sales numbers justified it and the performance reviews were flawless, and the numbers were staggering. By the age of 16, Red Top was reportedly generating $300,000 a month in revenue. That is $3.6 million a year in 1971 dollars. Adjusted for inflation, that is the equivalent of roughly $27 million a year in today's money. Think about that. A 16-year-old girl in the most competitive and violent drug market in the United States of America, generating Fortune 500 revenue before she was old enough to legally drive a car. She had employees. She had supply lines. She had a weekly payroll. She had territories. and she ran all of it while still showing up to school in the morning. She would walk into class wearing a full-length fur coat, sit down at her desk like it was the most normal thing in the world, and when her teachers asked about it, she did not lie, she did not deflect, she did not play coy. She told them exactly how much money she was making, and then she took those same teachers on shopping sprees to Bloomingdale's and Macy's, buying them clothes, shoes, jewelry, handbags, whatever they wanted, because she was operating at a level where impressing a school teacher was no longer something she needed to think about. She was not trying to be liked. She was not trying to show off. She was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar operation. Her teachers were not even in her tax bracket. The money came fast, and Red Top spent it like she was afraid it would disappear. Picture the scene. It is a Friday night in Harlem in the early 1970s. The after-hours clubs on Lenox Avenue are open, the music is loud, Marvin Gaye or Curtis Mayfield floating through the smoke, and the air smells like cigarette smoke and expensive cologne and possibility. Into the room walks a teenage girl who should be home studying for a geometry test, but she is not carrying textbooks. She is wearing a mink that costs more than the bartender's entire annual salary. Her hair, red and unmistakable, catches every light in the room. 2 gold chains on her neck, rings on her fingers. Behind her, men who run entire blocks of the heroin trade fall silent, not because they are afraid of her, because they are in awe of her. She has 2 Cadillacs parked outside on the street. One is black on black, sleek as a hearse, tinted windows so dark you cannot see the driver, chrome rims catching the moonlight. The other is white with red leather interiors, custom ordered, a car that screams money so loud the neighbors 3 blocks over can hear it pulling up. She owns a condominium in Riverdale, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the entire Bronx, a neighborhood where most of the residents are white professionals, doctors, lawyers, accountants, people who have no idea that the teenage girl down the hall is sitting on more cash than their entire floor combined. She is 16 years old, and she is richer than anyone in her building. She is richer than most of the people in her zip code. She runs with names that defined the entire era: West Indian Chuck, Stevie Baker, Cisco Kid. These were not teenagers. These were grown men, established operators, veterans of the Harlem drug trade who had been in the game since before Red Top was born, and she moved among them not as a student, not as a protege, not as someone's girl, as an equal. Her beauty created its own gravity field. Pee Wee Kirkland, the legendary playground basketball star from Harlem who had turned down the NBA to become a drug dealer because the streets paid more than professional basketball, wanted her. Freddie Myers, one of the biggest cocaine suppliers in New York City, wanted her. The rivalry between these 2 powerful men over Red Top's attention became one of the most talked about conflicts in the entire Harlem underworld, a beef that had nothing to do with drugs or territory or money, and everything to do with a teenage girl who had made herself the center of their universe without even trying. At her peak, Red Top was not just participating in the Harlem drug economy. She was one of its most visible symbols, a living, breathing proof of concept for what the game could give you if you were smart enough, bold enough, and fearless enough to take it. But here is what Red Top did not know. The same visibility that made her a legend was already writing the last page of her story, and she never saw it coming. Here is the contradiction at the center of this entire story, and you need to hold it in your mind for everything that comes next. Red Top was generous. That is not debatable, and it is not disputed by anyone who knew her. She took care of people in a way that went beyond business. She bought gifts for teachers who were barely making enough to pay their rent. She looked after friends who did not have what she had. She brought money into a community that had been deliberately, systematically starved of it for generations by policies with names that most Americans have never heard of: redlining, urban renewal, benign neglect. The federal government had a phrase for what it did to neighborhoods like Harlem. They called it planned shrinkage. They pulled out the fire stations. They pulled out the hospitals. They let the buildings rot. And into that void, a 16-year-old girl stepped in with cash and generosity and a willingness to take care of the people around her that no government agency had ever shown. She was doing what the city refused to do. She was the social safety net for the people in her orbit. And she was a child. But the product she was moving, the DOA-stamped bags, the blue magic she distributed for Frank Lucas, that product was destroying the same neighborhood she was trying to save. Every bag she sold created another addict. Every transaction funded another needle, another nod, another mother slumped on a couch while her children waited for dinner that was never going to come. Every dollar Red Top earned was connected to a chain of suffering that stretched from her hands to the veins of people who lived on the same blocks she walked every morning on her way to school. The heroin epidemic in Harlem in the early 1970s killed more Black Americans in that single neighborhood than most people are willing to count or even acknowledge. Overdoses in alleyways, young men found dead in bathrooms with needles still in their arms, families torn apart by addiction so powerful it rewired the brain and made a person choose the drug over their own children. And the product that was doing that damage had Red Top's stamp on it, DOA, dead on arrival. The stamp's name was never ironic, it was always the truth. She was the best thing and the worst thing that ever happened to the people closest to her. She was feeding families with one hand and burying them with the other, and she was too young to fully understand the weight of what she was carrying. The adults around her understood. Frank Lucas understood exactly what his product did. Frank Matthews understood it. They had seen the bodies. They had watched the funerals. They chose to keep going because the profit margin justified it in their minds. But Maxine was not Frank Lucas. She was not a grown man in his 40s who had made a cold, calculated decision to trade human suffering for personal wealth. She was a child, a brilliant, fearless, impossibly ambitious child who had been handed the keys to a machine she did not fully comprehend by men who absolutely should have known better and did not care enough to stop. And the community loved her anyway, because nobody else was doing anything at all. But here is what Red Top did not know. The world she lived in had a clock on the wall, and that clock was already counting down to zero. In 1972, the streets of Harlem were a powder keg with a short fuse. Nicky Barnes had consolidated power over the heroin trade through his council, the 7-man governing body that controlled distribution across New York and beyond. Barnes ran his operation with the discipline of a military organization. He had enforcers, he had accountants, he had lawyers, and he had a personal bodyguard known on the streets by a name that tells you everything you need to know. Black Sunday. Black Sunday did not negotiate. Black Sunday did not issue warnings. Black Sunday did not give second chances. When Nicky Barnes needed a debt collected or a message delivered, Black Sunday was the message. And one day in 1972, Black Sunday went to collect a debt from a man who owed Nicky Barnes money. The details of what happened next have been told 100 different ways in 100 different barbershops and living rooms across Harlem, but the result is always the same. Black Sunday found the man. There was a confrontation, words were exchanged, the situation escalated, guns came out, shots were fired, and one of those bullets, a stray round, not aimed at anyone in particular, not part of any plan, not the result of any war or any rivalry or any business dispute that had anything to do with Maxine Walters. One stray bullet hit Red Top. She was 17 years old. 17. She had built a multi-million-dollar operation from nothing. She had earned the respect of the most powerful drug lords in American history. She had her own brand, her own stamp, her own Cadillacs, her own condominium in Riverdale. She had generated more revenue in 2 years than most Americans generate in an entire lifetime of work. And she was killed by accident, a stray bullet in a dispute that had nothing to do with her. Not her enemies, not the feds, not a rival crew. Just bad luck. Just being in the wrong place at the wrong second in a world that killed people randomly and without apology, the same way a storm kills a tree. The irony is the part that stays with you. The very world that had made her powerful, the network of dealers and enforcers and bodyguards and kingpins, the ecosystem she had thrived inside, that ecosystem produced the bullet that killed her. She did not die because she failed. She died because she succeeded in a world where success and danger lived in the same room and shared the same air. The aftermath was not street chaos. It was grief chaos. The silence that falls over a neighborhood when everyone understands at the same time that something irreplaceable has just been taken. When her family went through her belongings, they found what was left of the empire she had built in 2 years, $4 million in cash, hidden inside her condominium in Riverdale, stacked behind walls and under floorboards, more money than most families on her block would see in 5 generations. 2 Cadillacs, one black on black, one white with red leather interiors. The same cars that had been parked outside every after-hours club in Harlem. The same cars that teachers and classmates and neighbors had watched pull up to the curb carrying a teenage girl in a fur coat who looked like she owned the entire city. They were just metal now, just objects with no one to drive them. And the funeral. The funeral was something Harlem had never seen for someone so young. Every major dealer showed up. Every kingpin, every lieutenant, every runner who had ever crossed paths with Red Top came to pay their respects. And the crowd that gathered was not just large, it was reverent. These were men who had seen everything the streets could show them, men who had buried friends and enemies alike without flinching, and they wept. They stood in that church, and they wept for a 17-year-old girl. And Nicky Barnes, the man whose bodyguard had fired the shot that killed her, spared no expense. He paid for Sammy Davis Jr. to perform at her funeral. Sammy Davis Jr., one of the most famous entertainers in America, singing at the funeral of a 17-year-old drug dealer from Harlem, because in that world, in that moment, that was the only gesture large enough to match the magnitude of what Harlem had just lost. And when the music stopped and the casket closed and the last car pulled away from the church, the streets went quiet in a way they had not been quiet in years. The Queen was gone, and nothing was going to replace her. Here is the math of Maxine Walters' life. From a struggling family on the poorest blocks in Harlem to a multi-million-dollar empire before she could legally vote. From a classroom desk in an underfunded public school to a distribution network that rivaled grown men with decades of experience and connections that stretched across state lines. From a girl watching a drug transaction through a window as a child to a woman, barely a woman, whose name was spoken in the same breath as Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes and Frank Matthews. From a fur coat in a high school hallway to $4 million in cash hidden behind the walls of a Riverdale condominium. And then a stray bullet from a gun that was never pointed at her. And then silence. And here is what makes this more than just a story about one girl from Harlem. When the histories were written, when the movies got made, when Hollywood turned Frank Lucas into Denzel Washington and Nicky Barnes into a documentary subject and a magazine cover and the entire Harlem drug trade into entertainment for mainstream America, they left Red Top out. They left out the teenage girl who moved their product, who earned their stamps, who built an operation that put grown men to shame and generated millions before she could legally sign a lease. They left her out because her story does not fit the narrative they wanted to sell. The narrative where the drug trade was a man's world, built by men, run by men, destroyed by men. Red Top's existence disrupts that entire story. It forces a question that America has never wanted to answer. What kind of system abandons a neighborhood so completely that a 16-year-old girl can become a millionaire by selling poison to her own neighbors? And the adults around her, the men who gave her the product and the brand and the supply line, those adults call it opportunity? What kind of country creates the conditions where a child's best option, her smartest play, the move that earns her the most respect and the most money and the most power she will ever have, is to become a drug dealer before she finishes high school? That is not a question about Maxine Walters. That is a question about America. That says more about this country than it will ever say about a girl named Red Top. She was 17 years old, and she was already a legend they were afraid to remember.